For those of you who don't know, Hill House Comics is a DC imprint that was spearheaded by Joe Hill, and they released comics like Basket Full of Heads, Plunge, Daphne Byrne, The Low Woods, and there was a backup story in all of those called Sea Dogs, which has now been collected, and The Dollhouse Family. So there are a handful of comics that you can check out from the imprint right now, but today what I want to talk about is whether or not this imprint was successful for DC Comics. And I was doing some searching, and due to distribution changes over the last year or two, it was a little all over the place with trying to find sales numbers, but what I did find came from this website called ICV2, and it showed that in September of 2020, when the trade came out for Basket Full of Heads, it was in the top 20 for sales by both unit and dollars. For units, it was in 16th place, basically, and then if you went by dollar amount, it bumped it up to the 12th spot, which I think goes to show that, one, Joe Hill is a pretty big name because he had already done comics like Lock and Key and the Wraith comic, which tied into his novel Nosferatu, so he was obviously going to drive some sales just by spearheading this imprint in general, I think. And what I noticed was that, he had his titles that he was writing, like Basket Full of Heads and Plunge and Sea Dogs, and then he brought in other talent for the other three titles. And now there is Refrigerator Full of Heads, which is a follow-up to Basket Full of Heads. So it's clear that DC liked what they saw with Basket Full of Heads, at least, to basically give that title a sequel. And DC had already taken a risk with horror comics when they did American Vampire with Scott Snyder, and that first trade was actually co-written with Stephen King, who some of you may know as Joe Hill's father and a very, very prolific author in his own right. So while Joe Hill doesn't have the amount of work that his dad does, he still has enough out there to have a track record, and I think that's why DC did this in the first place, honestly. So what I want to talk about is, one, whether or not this was a success for DC, and two, if they'll keep it going. So first up, we have whether or not it was a success. I would say that having any of these graphic novels pop up in the top 20 for sales in literally any given month of the year is definitely good for the imprint, because even though some of the others didn't show up in the top 20 sales or anything throughout 2020, and, they recently did a box set, which I don't think DC would have approved if they didn't think it was going to sell, because that actually collects Sea Dogs for the first time. So there's some extra incentive there for people to buy it if they hadn't bought the single issues with that backup story in it, because I read a couple of the digital trades. So they didn't have the backup story collected in any of those. They just had the main story for the Low Woods and Daphne Byrne and so on. So I actually haven't had a chance to read Sea Dogs because I did not collect the single issues. So there's definitely some incentive there to buy that box set if people are fans of the comics that came out on the Hill House Comics imprint. And to go back to Refrigerator Full of Heads real quick, as I'm recording this, they have 2 issues out so far, and there's going to be 6 in total. So we have a few more months of those issues coming out, and then I'm really hoping DC will let this continue, because it does seem like it did pretty well. Even if you look at some of the single issues, they aren't necessarily in the top 100 for sales, but, they're still outperforming other issues from Marvel or DC at times, and I think that's a good sign not only for DC, but for horror comics in general too, because we've seen an increase in sales in this genre. I mean, you take a look at James Tynion IV's work, and you have Something is Killing the Children, The Nice House on the Lake, that are selling like mad right now. They are doing so well, and I think even James is surprised with how well they've done based on what I've read in the Tiny Onion's newsletter that he does on Substack, in addition to now creating comics for Substack. So there's a lot to enjoy in the world of horror comics right now. So I think DC should sort of ride that and see what comes of Hill House Comics. And of course, that will depend on if Joe Hill is still into the idea of doing that. But I think it's safe to say he does enjoy the comics format, considering how much work he's done in it. So I'm pretty hopeful that this will keep going in some capacity, whether they do a full wave of comics again, or if they keep just putting out one here and there like they're doing now with Refrigerator Full of Heads. But if you've read any of the Hill House comics, let me know what you think of them in the comments. I would love to know if anyone else enjoyed these as much as I did. But that's all I have for you today. I wanted to keep this a short one here, and as always, you can follow me on socials and check out my podcasts, Welcome to Geekdom and Chat Cemetery. There are links to all of those things in the show description, so be sure to do that, and I will see you next time.